Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It is 1 o'clock in a very snowy Denver. It's 3 o'clock on the East Coast, and we are very happy that you've come to join us for Firewise's Wildland Urban Legends, where we will once again go down the rabbit hole of myths and truths and have our good guide tell us what's true and what we need to understand and learn more about. When people always ask me, how do you know Pat Durland's going to be a good speaker? I say, if any man would dye his mustache green for St. Patrick's Day, then it'll be a good time. And Pat certainly does that. Pat, actually, how long is it till the next St. Patrick's Day?
Well, I don't know if you did this intentionally, but it's 4 months to the day, buddy. You nailed it.
Yeah, we try. So Pat Durland is our speaker. My name is Lucian Deaton. I work with the Wildland division of NFPA. I manage our international outreach, and I get to explore these myths with Pat today, 15 of which we have, many of which we received from attendees of the webinar and others who shared with us things they've heard or things they've always known and wanted them to be explained. I think importantly also, to understand how to answer some things when they hear them from residents, from fire service, from others, because a lot of these myths are with us, and sometimes we don't know why. I know Pat's going to talk about that in a second. So, Pat, why don't you introduce yourself? And I know you're going to speak a little bit about why we have myths in the wildland arena as well.
Well, thanks for having me today, Lucian. I wanted to make that point first off because this is an important subject to me, and I started actually on the ground in wildland fire and I could count at 40 years. Okay. So,
but I got the badge at 40 and you were done.
Yeah. I had 10 seasons, with my feet on the ground and shovels and Pulaskis and that kind of stuff. And so I'm proud of that and proud to be a wildland firefighter and be associated with that. And, when I retired from the federal service in 2003, I had a national position on the fire staff for BLM in the Department of Interior. But, I think it's important to point out that for 12 years, I was on the National Wildland Urban Interface Initiative and Fire Program. And our tasks were largely firefighter safety and wildland urban events. And that group gave birth in the 1990s to today's Firewise program. So I've got a long history in this, and I'm still proud to still be involved with folks like Jack Cohen and Steve Quarles and so many others that have taken this issue and made it even more interesting and more solvable. Anyway, so, and I did want to mention, like you say, it concerns me that there's a lot of misinformation on this subject there is a lot of and misinformation going around this. And today we're going to try and break down some of that stuff because the tasks are tough enough with, getting people to take action. We don't want to find ourselves communicating crossways with each other, and in the fire community, tribal thinking is an issue, and so today I hope we learn how to think bigger. I hope to challenge some of the conventional thinking on this important issue and help move that forward. And I will say before we go that I'm going to be referring to a concept, and I wanted just to introduce it now. And it has to do with prescriptive versus performance standards. And a quick example would be of a prescriptive standard would be something that you hear from us often, that no trees within 10 feet of structures. And that fits well for the websites, fits well for the brochures and the door hangers, but when it comes to a performance issue, largely and often we don't have that option. When we see that there's emotional connections with that tree within 10 feet, we have to look at a performance standard. And We find that we can have a tree within 10 feet of a structure that won't threaten the ignition if we clean up the leaves in the gutter and manage the ladder fuels and the fuels surrounding it. So we're going to be talking about that issue a little bit too today.
Yeah, well, thanks, Pat. And I know that'll help as well, because sometimes we may see a myth and it has some truth in it as well. And that helps kind of frame how we'll be looking at these. Should say before we go on that if you do want to ask questions during the webinar, we certainly invite you to. On the left-hand side of the Google webinar piece, there is a blue chat box. And if you click on that, you can post things. We'll see them. We'll try to incorporate some while we're going through these. Certainly have some question time at the end. So let's move on to this first myth that we have. And this is one that, Pat, we've heard of a lot. Will mulch spontaneously combust in the heat? What say you?
Well, for our purposes, this is largely a myth. We have little evidence that organic mulches that we use around home and our landscaping designs will spontaneously combust. I know NFPA has told me that they have no data on, spontaneous organic mulch combustion in landscape and home settings. So occasionally we do hear of events where large, organic mulch piles like compost sites and cattle feed and haystacks, those kind of things are able to generate enough heat. And the issue there is that the heat, from microorganisms and decomposition, when it gets started in the middle of those piles, there's really no way for it to escape, and it just builds up until combustion begins. So we do have, there is some testing on mulch, and the issue really with mulch, of course, is that it does present a flammable issue next to a structure. And that's where the issue really lies. It's much more vulnerable from, an errant cigarette or sparks from a wildfire or a debris fire that we've found.
And certainly the dryness of the mulch can cause concern as well, that it will dry out. I know we often hear of trying to wet mulch to keep it in some moist form, but the quantity of that can start to pose a risk, as you're saying, to a cigarette or something else, not just the radiant heat from the sun on a given Saturday afternoon. Exactly.
And keep in mind that that there's different kinds of mulches, and some, we've talked about organic mulches. I know a few years ago I saw a piece on playgrounds, and I believe it was in Texas, that had rubber mulch on them, and a security camera caught them spontaneously combusting and supporting flaming combustion at a low level. So, and this goes to demonstrate, both these factors, that there are other non-organic mulches that may spontaneously combust, number one. And number two, lately we started talking about the first zone being that 0 to 5 foot zone next to the structure, and that's important, that we don't have combustibles like mulches in that zone.
Yeah, very true. Well, good. Let us move on to the second myth, or truth we don't know yet.
Yeah.
Be helpful if I looked before I moved. This one is one that we received from Becca Smolsky with the Southwest Colorado Firewise, and it raises an interesting point, because legitimately in headlines she said about a bicycle pedal causing a spark, causing a wildfire. But you hear about this from bullets on target practice, exploding targets, other things like that. What about the question? What about bicycle pedals starting wildfires? But what about the spark as well from anything, I suppose?
Well, not having seen bicycle pedal start fires, but other sources, like you say, I'd have to go with this one for sure. I know this year we've had golf clubs in Southern California start fires, of titanium alloy type golf clubs, and actually University of California, Irvine has done some research on that, and you can go on YouTube, do a little search, and you can see them getting some great sparks off of hitting a rock in the rough, if you will, and that titanium alloy hitting a rock, they tell me, at least in the study, indicates that the sparks from that are near 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and so if you have things like combustible mulch and rough at a golf course, we see, especially in the desert, we see situations where exploding targets and steel jacketed or tracer bullets, train brakes, all those things, can ignite those fine fuels very readily on the right day.
Mm-hmm. Now, Pat, there's a bit of paralysis that could occur because technically, if anything could create a spark, there is a risk of fire from that. So I think how should people put into the context of what they're doing in outdoor environments this risk of a spark from, for instance, a golf club? If someone was having to answer this question at an event or responding to someone's query on this, how do you make it not seem like almost paranoia that anything can create a fire out there?
Well, the first thing we have to do is let people know that these actions, make them aware that these actions can be problematic and on certain days and in certain areas, and and provide them some options or some restrictions. We had a fire outside of Boise a few years ago, and it was ignited from a shooting range. And the question became after that, what really? Why was that shooting range open on a red flag day? Mm-hmm. And why did they allow this individual or the suspected individual to be shooting tracer bullets in the middle of the day? So yeah, so it's, and again, some of that stuff is prescriptive, and sometimes we can post it, and sometimes if you're there talking to somebody or seeing that, you might tell them put the titanium club back in
It would never help my golf game, so it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Pull out the old beater sandwich or something.
Good enough. Let us see. Next one we received from a couple of folks in the insurance industry that we work with, Bob Kowalski for one, and others, and not certainly self-serving, but they wanted to share. Is this a myth or not? This question of my insurance company wants me to clear cut 100 feet or more around my home. At the beginning, Pat, you were talking about the prescriptive balance. What's going on here with this debate? Because certainly we hear it often. In Colorado, we do as well. But also, how should people understand and maybe answer those questions when they're in a meeting and it's being brought up?
Well, I'm going to go middle of the road on this one. And
it depends, huh?
The folks that have been in my training classes before know that I use this a lot. It depends. Here,
and Pat, I should say to your defense, one of the slides we have on here, we thought about calling myth-ish. So there are gradients to myths, and I think this is a good one to show that there are questions within questions, but go ahead.
Exactly, and there's not always definitive answers on this stuff, so it depends. That's a good one. You can get out of a lot of trouble with this answer. Anyway, we see this kind of guidance solution from not only insurance companies, but local fire jurisdictions and others as they are trying to convince people and educate them, on some safeguards to prevent loss from wildfires. And this is probably a good example of what I discussed earlier of the prescriptive versus performance standards. The prescriptive standards, like the, no trees within 10 feet, no open eaves. They're not one size fits all, or even one size fits most. You have to look at the specific situation and make a determination there. And to to the benefit of us that have insurance, the companies, those companies are educating themselves on this issue and what is effective and what might not be effective, and they're gaining ground here, and some of them still have to learn, as others in the fire service still have to learn that just a one cut across the board on all this stuff really doesn't do it for everybody. We have to generate some performance criteria and standards that may work on an individual basis.
Mm-hmm. And Pat, I think also it still leaves the question of the structure that you can clear. You can concrete within 100 feet of your home, but if your gutters are full of debris, that may become more of a risk than a more park-like tree environment around the property.
Exactly.
Yeah, very good.
And that's the deal with, we can have that tree close to the house if there's some emotional attachment to it, and because you planted it, you remember planting it with your dad, and he's not here anymore, and it does radiate, and the power company's telling you in their literature that it's going to absorb radiant heat from the sun and keep your air conditioning bill lower, and you want to keep it, well, let's keep it trimmed and keep the leaves out of the gutter.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, make it a part of the footprint of the area that you're trying to protect.
Exactly.
The next one, certainly one that we do hear a lot, and actually back in 2015, Firewise did a very good webinar, a virtual workshop on this issue of insurance and what sort of policies do you have, how to have that relationship with your insurance agency. But on this question of my insurance will cover the loss.
Well, I'd have to lean towards the myth side of this one, Lucian. Insurance folks will, at least the ones I've talked to, tell me that they're there to rebuild, of course, and get you back on your feet, but they're not going to make 100%. We're not going to get you back completely to where you were. And I've seen those folks that are underinsured and have found themselves, unfortunately, in a situation like the woman who I met. Insurance covered the rebuild of her home, but she was underinsured, and her new appliances, her carpeting, her window coverings, her landscape, all had to come out of her pocket. So it's important that a few years ago I interviewed an individual who lost his home, and he had intentionally reduced his insurance to 50 cents on the dollar to save money, and he lost his home to a fire, and he said, everybody thinks I'm good shape because I had insurance, and I'm ruined. He says, I'm not going to be able to retire early. And you know what I did after I had that discussion with him and hung up? I got back on the phone and talked to my insurance agent.
See how much, yeah. I think that effort of making sure of what you are covered for is very important. And there's also sometimes people forget that while a piece of furniture or a memento or whatever it may be has great value to us, everything is on an appreciated value of a scale for the insurance of it, because it's going to lose value over time. When you go back and learn about what you're covered for, you can get specific riders, for instance, for things that you want to maintain a certain value for replacement, if they have that same value for yourself. And those are things that your insurance companies will work with you on, because in the end, they do want you to be covered. It is a partnership. But sometimes people find out after the fact what they were actually covered for.
Yes, what really, what kind of gets my goat and under my skin is when somebody says, well, don't worry, I'm not worried, and I have insurance, and that makes me recall the individual I worked with after the Black Forest, 2 years after the Black Forest fire in Colorado, who had lost his home. And as I was leaving, he made the comment that stuck with me. He said, yep, he says, 2 years after the fire, and I'm 40% back to where I was.
Very true. Well, let us move on to the next one here. This one, we're going to move from insurance. Now we're going to look at some home safety issues. Tile roofs are safe from embers. Technically, by design, they should be. What do you think, Pat?
Well, we used to think that was a golden, but anymore it depends. The risk is more than it is just from the covering or what we call the feel of the roof, and that's usually what we used to look at very hard. And what we missed was the openings.
Mm-hmm.
We used to look at, and we used to be concerned about whether it's Class A, Class B, or Class C rated assembly, and that's just a basis of the size of the firebrands that would be landing on it. And now we know the science has told us that really, if it's rated Class A, Class B, or Class C resistant, we're good from a wildfire perspective. We don't have to give different values on our inspection sheets to those different ratings. So the question that's more important, are there openings that will allow embers to enter the attic or the structure? Like, on the right-hand side of this picture here, we see our little bird friend who comes back every year and builds a new nest and in a new opening there, and that opening is designed for airflow and ventilate the roof. And when there is a fire and there is embers, that particular house is going to ignite the bird nests under there, the embers are, and it's going to burn from the inside out.
Yeah. Pat, talk to me about, for lack of better words, the complacency sometimes when someone would, in this case with Mr. Bird there, the roof may survive and the house would burn underneath it. Can the assumption of a Class A roof sometimes shadow the risks that are around it if it's not maintained as well as it should? I know you've seen a lot of that in the class outreach that you've done.
Well, that's a great point, because we come to what we're looking at here are fairly simple roof structures. And when we have a complex roof structure that has dormers or vertical walls extending from the roof decking or sheeting itself, even on a Class A roof now, if we see a number of embers or of debris, find those corners and find those crevices and build up, and then the embers land on those, and now we have, the roof will maintain preventing ignition through its surface, but now we have flames on the vertical surface on the dormer and under another eave, perhaps on debris there, and that becomes problematic with those complex roof surfaces, even with Class A type roof materials.
Very good. Well, I know I want to move on next to one of your favorite myths. I know you this one's very close to your heart, and you like to see it every time it comes up. Curtains could ignite due to radiant heat before the glass breaks. And this actually from IBHS, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, they have shared some research with us that they are doing on this very myth. They're not doing it on a webinar, but doing it in the lab in South Carolina to put it to the test. So, Pat, what both you know and you've learned?
This is not only a myth. I would classify this as a classic myth, or the myth that will never die. And I would suspect people still have this one on their list of things to do before you leave when a wildfire approaches. Take down the
curtains. Yeah. What do you think resonates with that? Why does it continue? Because I know you'll get to the research in a second about what they tested to find out, but does it seem evident to a person because they'd assume flammability, or what gives this thing legs?
I think some of our own traditional tribal thinking is what gives us legs. This is one that's been on our list for a long time, and there's others out there too. And I'd ask people to look at that and look at their lists of publications. And I counted a few years ago 39 things that one of our publications was suggesting we do when a wildfire approaches. And that's just not feasible to think that that's going to get done. And especially these days when we're seeing fire behavior like we've never seen before, people need to just get their family and in a lot of these cases and just get out as soon as they possibly can. So.
Very true. And I know the research from IBHS, if you want to touch on that quickly, just what they found when they did this test with the window, with the curtains behind that you'd usually have in a house.
Yes, and thanks to IBHS and Steve Quarles for putting this on their list. I actually sent this into Mythbusters a few years ago, and they didn't pick up on it, but Steve did, and I'm glad he did, because what he found is that he couldn't get the curtains to ignite until he could get the glass to break and leave the frame, and even then it took the curtain, more than a minute to ignite after the glass broke. And that was, we're talking from radiant heat source here, not direct flame contact. And this is a good example, like you mentioned, of how our own lack of understanding, even in cases of the fire service with our traditional and tribal thinking, lack of understanding of the new findings and the new science is continues to perpetuate some of these myths, and we need to educate ourselves and move beyond that.
Right, Drew. Let's continue on the research side. This is another one that in the same lab in South Carolina, IBHS is wrestling with as well. Composite materials used around a home or for decking purposes are non-combustible.
Myth. And and what I would tell you is that, people are always, and I did this myself. I had redwood deck, and I decided I was going to replace it with a composite material years ago. And I did that largely because of laziness. Okay. When actually the test results show that redwood and other woods are a nice product. Some of these composite materials will heat up and you can't walk on them barefoot, those kind of things. So, I'm not trying to beat up on wood decks here, but the composite stuff has become popular and largely because it's lower maintenance, but they are definitely not a fireproof material. Actually, a few years ago, an individual in one of my classes told me about fire he responded to where an individual put one of these portable fire pits on his deck, ignited the fire inside this pit, walked inside to get a drink, looked out a little while later and his deck was on fire. And what had happened is the radiant heat from the bottom of that fire pit had caused his composite decking, that plastic and wood fiber material, to sag. The leg went down from the fire pit and dumped the fire on the deck, and away we go. So they're particularly vulnerable to flaming exposures like that.
Yeah, and I should say that picture as well on the slide, the IBHS was testing that, and this gets to maintenance, that the deck is fine, but the material under the deck could burn enough to finally ignite the stuff above it. And that's something to think about. We'll move on to the next slide here, but something to think about with even something that is far more safe to radiant heat can still become a risk if it has direct flames against it over time.
Right, so, and Jack Cohen's always said that flame contact on a structure is a bad deal, and again,
yes, doesn't help.
That 0 to 5 foot zone extends, around those kind of decking attachments and wood walkways and other things. If it's attached to the house, it's part of the house. That's another one.
And it's a good segue because on this one, we're talking about zones again. The myth that was shared with us is my home is safe if my wood pile is 30 feet from the structure.
Depends. It depends again. I mean, will it ignite? This one didn't ignite in the photo. Have you noticed that the house burned behind it and the trees burned, but the wood pile survived? We have to ask ourselves, again, this is prescriptive, falls in that prescriptive performance category. Not all wood piles are created the same. will it easily ignite? This wood pile is, of round logs, not quartered or halved. They look fairly fresh, not a lot of spider webs, not a lot of leaf or pine needle litter on them, and they're on a moist area that wouldn't support ignition. So that, if a wood pile 30 feet from a house may not be far enough away. If maybe it needs to be more, depending on how big it is, how flammable it is, and if it ignites, will it make flame contact on other fuels that make it to the house or the house itself. So this is, and this is, I ask in our training classes, I ask people, to consider that if you're out there talking to somebody and you can tell that their wood pile is within 30 feet and maybe it's within 10, but you can tell with the conversation, the way it's going, that this wood pile is going nowhere. Now you have to look for the performance option. And one might be that we put a tarp over the top of it.
Very true. Let us move on to the next myth. This is one that you and I have had some fun researching. I can protect my home from burning embers with swimming pool water. This will also sometimes go into foam or extinguishers or other things, but it's the idea of tackling the risk head on and dealing with those embers as they're falling or just after, but using sources that are available. So, Pat, what say you on this? Because this is probably one that a lot of people hear.
Okay, I'm going to hedge my bet again and go with it depends.
Uh-huh. But how so? Why? Because I think technically someone could protect their home with.
Well, the first question, you got to be there, right, Lucian?
This is true.
And that's my luck. I looked into this years ago when I was living on the interface, and I realized that I'm not going to be there. So maybe I need to think of something else. So, and if I am there, the question becomes, have I prepared myself? Am I able-bodied and able to handle this? And am I ready to deal with a life-threatening situation if this thing is as severe as the wildfires we see this day with no escape? Because you have to consider: am I going to hit the panic button and be late? For evacuation and put myself in either more danger. What if I run out of water, or the power goes out, or the pump runs out of fuel? Then I wish I'd left an hour ago. Mm-hmm. So, like remember George Carlin said, it's just stuff. It's the irreplaceable stuff is human life. So that's But on the other hand, if you have taken the time to harden your structure to ember ignitions and the surrounding fuels are managed so they won't allow flames to reach a structure, and you become trapped or you don't have time to get out, maybe that's your safest place to be.
That's very true. I think in Firewise especially, we would look at this and say that the items on your deck, the deck furniture, other pieces, which would then be at risk to embers falling on the property, or what you should spend any time you may want to put to getting away from the home or putting away and protecting from embers, so that frankly embers can fall on your property and it doesn't matter. If you need to defend it in that way, there may be something more going on. And the evacuation piece, Pat, that you bring up makes a lot of sense. If you're leaving late after having tried to defend, you may be getting in the way of the fire services that are trying to come into an area to assess or to make a stand. So we will move on to the next one here. And this is one that we do hear a lot, because people think of wind strength. They think of climate change and these much stronger fires that we're seeing. The buildup of fuels in some areas where we're modeling may be different now. Firewise principles are not effective in the face of severe, that's the key word, wildfire behavior.
Really untrue. This is a myth. Even though today's disastrous wildfires are fueled by drought conditions and dry fuels like we haven't seen in a long time, and pushed by strong winds. How many times have we heard the so-called experts, say in the past couple of years, in 30 years of wildfire fighting, I've never seen fire behavior like this before, and that's starting to get old to me. We need to think bigger. I mean, if we haven't thought about this, especially after some of this recent history, we need to think bigger. We're living in our own little world, and we're not prepared for what many folks are seeing. But even in these events, what does the media show us after the fact? They show us the so-called miracle structures that have survived, and so we do see these survival situations, and there's nothing miraculous about what's happened to those structures that survived. It basically comes down to the facts that they didn't meet the requirements for combustion, and that was either by chance or it was by design and work by the homeowner and the community. So that's really what it boils down to. I think it's important to mention that in the U.S. our ecosystems require wildland fire, and we're going to have them under the most severe conditions we're seeing. And our friend Jack Cohen, who works on this, has quoted, I think it's prophetic. He says, "We don't have a wildfire problem. We have a structure ignition problem, and we can fix that. That's the good news."
And those are things that can be done around, regardless of conditions that are bringing it. So let us move to the next one here. This one, certainly we do hear a lot. I don't live in a wildland, so why should I worry? The idea of geographic definition of it. Or I don't live in California, the Rocky Mountains, so I don't have to worry about wildfire. This idea the wildfires are a Western issue. Pat, what do you say?
I say myth. I think we need to think bigger about this issue, Lucian, and expand our narrow perspectives if that's how we're thinking. And we've caused some of this problem ourselves with confusing ourselves with terminology, interface, intermix, occluded, open space. What did Steve Pine say years ago? He said wildland urban interface. He said a dumb name for a dumb problem. I thought that was hilarious and very true. So we can't continue to think of this as a geographic location issue. It's not where you live. It's how you live, and I ask folks, what would happen if I brought my ember generating machine to your house on a hot windy day and fired it up, and we'll just see how your home and your landscape responds, and that would be more warning than you're going to get likely when it really does happen. And those areas of risk and ignitable fuels are not places, but they're your structure and its surroundings.
Yeah. I've always talked about how the media will pick up a wildland fire burning in the West because it's burning thousands of acres, and it creates that media moment that they can cover where, literally the fire may be the size of Delaware. So try and translate it to a small fire on the East Coast. Doesn't seem to make the news, but there may be a 2-acre, not wildland fire by term, but brush fire, leaf fire, bog fire, whatever it may be called locally, that has more homes at risk, or has more. The smoke is impacting more population than before, and as of course we're seeing right now in the Carolinas, in Arkansas, in Georgia, they are dealing with multiple forest fires that are going on in an area that they wouldn't perceive they have a problem, but of course the risk is the same.
Well, and keep in mind, if you have ignitable conditions around your structure, it doesn't have it's going to that threatens you. It could be a cigarette, it could be fireworks, it could be a number of things. A few years ago, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, a chimney fire blew across a central area of Washington State and blew across a grass field and ignited 20-some homes on the other side of the field, because of the ignitable conditions. And a few years ago in the Sleepy Hollow Fire 2015, we saw embers from the Sleepy Hollow Fire fall into the community, and well within the community, mile and a half away from the fire, landed on cardboard products at a recycling plant and burned the recycling plant
Very
down.
true. Very true. Yeah. Well, let us move on to the next one here, because I think it segues quite well. The fire service will protect my home.
Well, that's that's what we would hope, and truth be told, we do the statistics 98% of the time. That's going to be the case. It's going to be an average day. There's going to, if there's an incident, the responders will be there and take care of it. It's that 2% of the time when conditions are extreme, fire behavior is extreme, and there are more homes. There are more homes at risk than there are resources to protect them. And I'd have to say that the fire service certainly has a responsibility to educate constituents on their vulnerability to wildland fire and interior fires and all those hazards of ignition. But they're largely based to respond. And they, so after the fact, they go home, and the residents and insurers remain there to rebuild their homes and families.
Very true.
So, and so it's important to remember, in the old days we used to give in more tribal historic knowledge that some of you have already heard, but we used to give points to people for having a fire hydrant, living next to a fire hydrant, and having a swimming pool and having an address, and really, if nobody is there to show up and there's more homes at risk than there are fire engines or responders in the real world, we don't get any points for having a fire hydrant there if nobody hooks up to it.
Very true. Move on to the next one here, and this is one that you hear often. The neighboring landowner, could be a house, could be forest, park, ranch land, hasn't done thinning or other mitigation, so there's nothing I can do to protect my home from the hazard. Pat, what say you? I mean, it makes sense. They could do all they can, but in the face of, gigantic risk, what's going on?
This is an often heard excuse and statement, but a myth nonetheless. It's true that in most cases, or a lot of cases, not every resident has 100 feet of space like we talk about when we talk about the home ignition zone to themselves to do whatever they want. And that's where it gets complicated, because now we move from implementing the physical science of what will burn and what will make us ignition resistant in our home ignition zone to the social science of striking up that conversation with a neighbor and or other community partners, and those community partners may be a government agency or a park or a reserve or preserve that borders us. So that's where the partnerships and the stakeholders become key in moving beyond that and solving those ignition problems in a localized area on a community basis. And that's where Firewise communities and fire adapted communities, Fire Safe Council, and other efforts like that have provided a lot of structure and support to addressing these concerns.
And this truly is a global frustration. NFPA had the opportunity to be in the UK back in October, working with partners there about wildland fire risks and Firewise adoption and the rest. And the challenge there was building that communication, like you were describing, Pat, to have the neighbors learn from, in this case, the heath management groups, what is being done, or what were some of the hurdles that were keeping them from getting some things done. And what they found was that the neighbors were able to come and help. Sometimes it isn't, apathy or disdain for why things aren't occurring. In this case, it was just the bit of budget and some community acceptance that work had to be done, and then it worked. So here as well, those are things that can be, that hurdle can be gotten over, can't it?
It takes work, but it's a worthwhile effort, and you're right, Lucian. It can be done.
Mm-hmm. Well, we got two left. Want to get through these? I know there are some questions that have come in. We want to encourage, if anyone has others, to submit them on that chat button, which is on the upper left of your function. But on this one, Pat, firefighters will pass by your home if you haven't created a defensible space. Gets back to kind of the red rock, green rock. What say you here?
Well, this one depends again, Lucian. Like we say, it's a situational issue. In severe event, responders have to think about their safety as well.
Quite true.
And where they're going to position themselves, and that of course depends on where they're at. If they're out in front of the fire, a number of hours before or days before plans to arrive, and have time, they will do what we call triage homes and area, and find those areas where they can operate safely with a good chance of saving homes without exposing themselves to danger. So, and if you have taken action and implemented those actions that will reduce your ignitability to your structure, that's often where they will land. What they're going to look at is they're going to look at those places that are going to withstand on their own. They're going to look at those places that are extremely dangerous and avoid those, and they're going to find those areas in the middle between those that they may be able to save if they take some mitigation action. So that's going to help them out. If there's a safe area for them to be, it's going to attract them, and you're going to benefit from that if you've taken that action to Firewise your property.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Move on to this one here, which I think is very good because it gets at the larger policy issue that's going on at the local level, then it's state and federal. This question of whose responsibility is it? Meeting the requirements for structural ignition is a local issue. Sometimes you hear that from the locals talking up. Sometimes you hear that from the top kind of pushing. But what is both the myth of that, and then also how should people tackle this, Pat?
This one is true, 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 true.
I only got one true on the slide. I should have put
Okay, well.
But a fourth, a quad truth, deserves some time for explanation here. What do you think?
Well, and again, Lucian, the proof is that homes, we always see homes that have survived and that just amaze us, but it's again the process of combustion, and once we understand how that works, it becomes fairly logical, and we're able to not only get it, but we're able to see those things that contribute to it and mitigate those, and that's, like we said, it's an individual based on each individual situation in each structure and each location. So as Jack says, we don't have a wildfire problem, we have a structure ignition problem, and wildfire responds better to mitigation than other perils. And the quote I use is, we can't change the path of a tornado, but we can change the path of a wildfire. By taking pre-event mitigation actions, we can actually determine on a localized area where it can and cannot exist, and small distances and small things make big differences. And sometimes this is one that our insurance partners are having a little trouble struggling with sometimes, because they're used to getting analytical data from a provider of some sort, and they just like to make that decision on the risk exposure from wildfire based on some aerial photos and some lineal distances from fuels, and really without a inspection, that's difficult to do. This is totally, from an insurance perspective, an inspectable hazard.
Very true. Very good, Pat. I want to before we move to questions, and no one should feel at all intimidated in asking a question, pay no attention to the bear. We want to thank you for reviewing these 15 myths that we've talked about. I think some of the context of, when we did this virtual workshop in 2015, we looked at those myths and really hit on them. I think this year it's been nice to look at why the myths exist, and I appreciate some of your insight on helping the audience understand how to get at some of the questions when they receive them. Why is the person asking in the first place? Why does that myth still stick around, and how do you overcome it? But on some questions, let me first just say that I misspoke on a picture a little ways back when we were talking about the composite materials flammability concerns that IBHS has been looking at. That picture and actually that research was at the University of California that Steve Quarles was doing. He was a part of the state extension program there. Ed Smith from Nevada was also involved. And though certainly IBHS has been focusing on it, that picture was from University of California. One question that came up, and then there was a question about insurance that I want to bring up last. This is just more of a direct mitigation question, Pat. This is Raymond had asked verbatim, we live in Pine Wooey. Pine tree, wildland interface. If trees are limbed up and ladder fuels have been eliminated, do the annual pine needle and pine cone drop present a fire danger? Should they be removed, and if so, how far away from the home? This is certainly in the home ignition zone concept. So what would you say on this, Pat?
Pine needle litter can pose a significant problem. It supports, low intensity flaming combustion on the ground, and that can lead to flame contact on the structure. Excuse me, like Jack Cohen says, a bad deal. The good news is that it's easy to mitigate. I talked to a friend just the other day who went out and bought himself a great, what he claims is a great leaf blower, and he says, he can blow those pine needles up into windrows, and literally roll them. I know people have spent $70 on the best rake they've found to deal with pine needles, and these same people have, removed the pine needles away from their structure. And again, we certainly don't want to see pine needles in that 0 to 5 foot zone, and we'd feel better if they were mitigated in that 30-foot zone from the structure, as well as off the roof and out of the gutters. So a problematic fire source, but one that is, can be managed fairly easily.
Yeah. Well, and Pat, we're pine needles and the debris can be of risk and should be of concern. I know, in Georgia, where my wife's family's from, pine needles are used as mulch. And I remind my mother-in-law every time that we really shouldn't be using that, but it's everywhere, literally. Here in the West, obviously, there is the juniper. And Edmund Van Dorn posed a question, give about 2 minutes or so on this one. It says, Pat, how do you feel about junipers as a fire hazard? Obviously, there are myths both ways around this one, aren't there? If you weren't too if you weren't too hard over them in class, you had taught several years ago. So putting them in a context then, but Colorado Springs Fire Department certainly sees them as risk. So how should someone deal with a juniper? And why do you think some may see it as more of a risk and others not? What do you think?
I think I'm being baited here. I've had people know how I feel about juniper, and then they know that my wife has an opposing viewpoint. So what I've learned the hard way, but it's solved my family strife has been that junipers can be very volatile, number one, and problematic, and they can support fairly moderate intensity flaming, and they're often close to homes, and that's problematic. The good news is that we can trim the dead branches up and like the lower third, if you will, up from the ground from the juniper, and remove those dead branches and remove the juniper debris from underneath. And I personally did that at my property next to my redwood deck, and I would maintain that every year. And juniper is a maintenance issue, and we can have, and that's the beauty of the science, the physical science, is that we know now that even ignition prone plants can be trimmed and maintained to become ignition resistant plants. And that works the other way too. Some of our plant lists, we find that we say, well, so, this is a fire resistant plant, and then we see them planted in an area where they're not getting enough water and they're decadent, and they have a lot of debris. And so it really boils down to maintenance.
Very true. And even the maintenance can also go towards the density of them, and that can be thought of as they are of concern. How do you reduce them so that they maintain that view, but not create a problem?
So the bottom line there, Lucian, is buy yourself some clippers, save your marriage.
We offer Wildland advice. We offer marital advice. It goes on the same virtual workshop. Pat, we've got about 2 minutes left, and I want to hit on a topic that you were talking about earlier when we were talking about insurance, and I think we can clean out with this one. When we were speaking about the coverages and will my insurance cover the loss, Breanne Stevenson here said, as an insurance agent, I would agree in making sure you understand your coverages. One key component is understanding if you have replacement cost or actual cash valued coverage. So those are two things to look for. But Pat, in that, how do you've spoken to people about home inventories for materials and the rest. How do you take that all into account, and when do you do it when you're looking at a wildfire risk?
Well, I think the best way to do that, not being the insurance expert and having some, a lot of experience working with those folks, is to take the opportunity to have those discussions with your insurance folks, and you'll find out if you know this subject in short order whether they are well versed on this or not. And if they're not, my advice is to help them understand it. And I've seen folks, insurance folks, underwriters looking at Google Earth, and I thought this is great until I found out we were looking at something completely different. I was looking at the junipers, the condition of the junipers around the home, and they were looking for how far the fire hydrant was from the home. And then when the local fire chief in the class said, well, and the other thing you ought to know about that fire hydrant is they're not charged. So it's important that, the underwriters have the right information to make, exposure analysis, and that we can continue to provide a level of insurance both ways, from accurate information insurance adjusters and underwriters, and from the benefits that mitigation actions that the homeowner has taken can provide. And it's a slow process, but we're making some headway on it. So don't give up. Work with your local folks.
Yeah, and it's true as well in working with the local insurance folks that they are not out to get you, and they probably know about the risk that's on the property already, so nothing's being hidden, but that you can work with them to find ways to reduce the risk. Because at the end of the day, they want you to they don't want you to lose anything. They have a concern about it just as much as you do. So there's certainly those pieces there. Well, Pat, I know we're almost out of time. I have seen there are some other questions that have come in, and we just don't have time for them on this formal recording of the webinar. But what I will say is that Pat and I are going to get at some of these questions that have come in on the Firebreak blog that NFPA has for Wildland Fire, and we're going to pose it and then answer it in that blog. We'll be posting those in the next couple of weeks. We've got about 4 or 5 that have come in, so we'll spread them out with other materials that are on there. But that's the Firebreak blog that's on NFPA. And being at the top of the hour, Pat, I want to thank you for going over these myths once again, for bringing some truth to them, but also bringing some understanding of why they exist. And hopefully now people can, when they hear them, answer them, but also be able to talk with a person raising the question to help them out in their situation. But Pat, any closing thoughts before we end the webinar?
I just want to thank everybody for, their dedication and interest on this subject, because, like we've talked, this is a solvable problem. We can take this one off the list for future generations, and that's why I'm passionate about this. And it's my pleasure, and hope to see all you folks, and best of luck.
Very good. Thank you, Pat. And to let everyone know, this webinar will be, virtual workshop will be posted on YouTube, and we'll have links to that and some more description on the Firebreak blog as well in the coming days. So you all have a good day. From a snowy Denver, have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.